Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when we think about the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939, the standard narrative usually paints a pretty clear picture, right? A liberal, democratic republic fighting desperately against the rising tide of authoritarian fascism led by General Franco. It's a story we've heard a million times. But hidden right behind that conventional front line was something entirely different. We are talking about one of the largest experiments in workers' self-management in human history, a massive, sweeping social revolution led not by politicians in suits, but by millions of ordinary workers and peasants. Today, we're going to explore how these everyday people built an entirely new society from the ground up, literally right in the middle of a war zone. Okay, let's quickly run through our agenda for today. We're covering 1. Myth versus reality. 2. The roots of Spanish anarchism. 3. The blueprint for revolution. 4. The collectives in action. 5. Compromise and state control. And finally, 6. The end of the experiment. Let's dive in. Section 1. Myth versus reality. Shattering the illusion. We really have to start by comparing the binary view of the war with the reality of this profound social revolution. Now, this is absolutely wild. As the reporter Burnett Bulletin noted at the time, millions of discerning people outside of Spain were kept in total ignorance by a deliberate policy of duplicity. And this wasn't just some accidental oversight by the press. It was highly calculated camouflage. Certain political factions within the Republican camp actively worked to hide the fact that workers had effectively seized control of the economy. Why? Well, they knew that if foreign democracies realized a massive anti-capitalist revolution was underway, international support for the Republic would just evaporate overnight. Our explainer today draws heavily from the documentary history edited by Sam Dolgoff, along with critical analysis from historians like Wolfgang Haug. They detail an era where regular people created their own institutions, totally bypassing traditional hierarchies. Just imagine a functioning society where defense militias operated without standard military ranks, where everyday citizens took direct democratic control over massive industrial factories, and peasants managed huge tracts of farmland together. It wasn't just some theoretical utopia, it was real life for millions of people. Moving on to Section 2, Roots of Spanish Anarchism. Let's step back and figure out exactly how this ideology actually took root in those rural villages and urban factories. So this didn't just happen out of nowhere. We are talking about nearly 70 years of painstaking grassroots organizing. It kicked off in 1868 when Giuseppe Finelli introduced the anarchist ideas of Mikhail Bakunin to workers in Madrid and Barcelona. The idea spread like wildfire, eventually leading to the creation of the CNT in 1910, which was this massive anarcho-syndicalist labor union. And to make sure this booming union didn't lose its radical edge and drift into regular politics, a vanguard group called the FAI was set up in 1927. Together, they built this absolute powerhouse of support among the working class. To really grasp the internal drama of the war, you've got to understand the deep philosophical divide within the Spanish labor movement itself. On one side, you have the CNT. They were all about total, decentralized coordination, relying on local assemblies and delegates who didn't even get paid. Their stronghold was in places like Catalonia and Andalusia. On the flip side, you had the UGT, the mainstream socialist union. They were super centralized, more reformist than revolutionary, and ran things from major hubs like Madrid. As you can guess, these two completely different visions of society were on a collision course. Now, here's a surprising takeaway that totally flips the script. A common myth is that these agrarian peasants just wanted a simple, primitive life, right? Like they were rejecting the modern world. Actually, scratch that. This was a radical, popular enlightenment. The anarchists aggressively championed modern science, evolutionary theory, and the heavy use of agricultural machinery. They literally set up rural libraries and secular schools because they believed that advanced tech and education were the absolute keys to freeing humanity from grueling manual labor. All right. Section 3, the blueprint for revolution. Moving into the 1930s, the sources make it clear that the 1936 revolution wasn't just spontaneous chaos. They had a plan. To replace the states, they visualized a decentralized society built meticulously from the bottom up. Power started right there on the factory floor with local worker assemblies, and then scaled up to regional federations, and finally a national committee. Why does this matter? Well, this structure was explicitly designed to keep the final say directly in the hands of the workers. It prevented some new bureaucratic elite from taking over, while still allowing for incredibly complex nationwide coordination. It's like a pyramid, but upside down when it comes to power. Consider these demands they laid out in 1931. Deeply practical, totally uncompromising. They weren't just throwing around vague philosophies. They demanded the outright expropriation of massive estates without paying a single cent to the wealthy absentee landowners. They wanted tools distributed for free and the absolute abolition of crippling agrarian debts and mortgages. This wasn't a wish list, folks. It was their literal, step-by-step blueprint for taking over the rural economy. To really get what they were aiming for, we have to define what collectivism meant for them. Simply put, it meant getting rid of traditional bosses entirely. The workers jointly owned their tools and directly managed production themselves. Whether it was a massive textile mill or an olive orchard, they sat down and decided what to make it, and how to share the rewards, cutting state bureaucrats and wealthy landlords completely out of the picture. Section 4. The Collectives in Action. When the military rebellion began in July 1936, the workers and peasants didn't hesitate. They put this blueprint into action immediately. With the central government basically paralyzed by the fascist uprising and the police nowhere to be found, millions just seized control. They didn't wait around for some official legal decree. They just walked in, restarted the dormant factories, took over the public transit networks in huge cities like Barcelona, and started farming the big estates as collective groups. It was a massive wave of regular citizens improvising libertarian communism on the fly. And the craziest part? They actually kept the economy running. Think about this number for a second. 57,934. That is the exact number of rural workers already represented at a labor congress way back in 1888. This data point is so crucial because it proves that the explosive wave of collectives in 1936 wasn't some sudden, chaotic accident caused by wartime panic. No, it was the result of over a half-century of deeply ingrained, multi-generational organizing. The foundation for this had been poured decades in advance. Which brings us to Section 5, Compromise and State Control. Because as the Civil War intensified, pure anarchist theory crashed violently into wartime reality. Look at the strict compromises they had to make in the October 1936 collectivization decree. To legitimize their new collectives, the C&T leaders actually joined the Republican government. Under Articles 5 and 10, workers gained official legal recognition and could elect their own enterprise councils. But here's the catch, right there in Article 34. The State Economic Council retained the absolute final say. So in exchange for formal legitimacy, the movement allowed the state to place a hard legal ceiling on the revolution. And this brings up a fascinating, honestly tragic, wartime paradox. To survive a brutal, mechanized conflict against Franco, you absolutely need intense, centralized resource planning. But that is the exact opposite of decentralized local ideals. The anarchists fundamentally despised the state apparatus, yet to defeat fascism, they found themselves cooperating with the very hierarchical structures they had spent their entire lives trying to destroy. Naturally, this created a massive structural clash that really defined the rest of the war for the Republic. Picture this. On one side, you have local factory committees passionately demanding to set their own hours, control their surplus, and produce for their own communities. On the other side, you've got the Central Ministry of War, increasingly backed by Soviet advisors bringing in essential weapons, demanding total centralized control over all raw materials to feed the frontline troops. Something had to give. And that leads us into Section 6, the end of the experiment. Ultimately, this movement was crushed, and not just by fascist forces, but by internal political rivals. This timeline is pretty tough to look at. It tracks the systematic dismantling of the collectives from within the Republican camp itself. In May 1937, communist-led government brigades actually attacked and destroyed functioning anarchist collectives in Aragon. By early 1938, the C&T tried desperately to save their system at the Valencia Congress, but the political momentum was gone. Finally, in August 1938, a government decree officially nationalized the war industries. Just like that, the era of direct worker control was over. By late 1938, the toll was just staggering. Over 800 union-controlled war industry factories in Catalonia alone were forcibly nationalized. The local worker committees protested, of course. They knew their revolution was being stolen from them, but it was completely useless. The very Republican state they had compromised with, the state they had joined to fight the war, had effectively stripped them of the self-management they bled to build. So even before the fascists achieved their final military victory in 1939, the internal social revolution had already been defeated. But honestly, the sheer scale of what millions of everyday people managed to organize in that brief window, coordinating complex, heavy industries and vast farmlands without traditional bosses, owners, or politicians, remains a monumental, often totally forgotten accomplishment of the 20th century. For a brief moment, they proved an entirely different economic model was physically possible. I want to leave you with this final question to ponder. Can a decentralized society ever truly survive the intense pressures of modern warfare and concentrated state power? The Spanish Civil War gives us a breathtaking glimpse into a society actually run from the bottom up, but it also exposes its crushing vulnerabilities when faced with ruthless realpolitik. Think about how these historical lessons might apply to modern movements and how we organize today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.